We are joined today by Nicola Lake with Resource Vol, who will be leading us through our presentation. We have just a few announcements. For housekeeping purposes, you're on mute. We are struggling to find out what is happening with our chat box, and so for right now, if you'll just use the Q&A section for questions, comments, we are excited to have your engagement. We will be recording this session and placing it on the Alive member side so that you have access to the recording later. We want to make sure you're aware of our February Alive Academy, which happens on Tuesday, February 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We're talking about proven strategies for recruitment and retention of Latinx volunteers with Monica Jasko. Monica has more than 25 years experience with adult learners and in the nonprofit field, and so we're excited to hear from her in February. We are honoring Gretchen Jordan. This is our first time doing an Alive Academy without her, and we miss her dearly. And we know that all of you have had special connections with her over her time that she's been here with Alive. So if you're able to join us tomorrow for a celebration on Zoom of Gretchen, we would love for you to do that. You can find more details on our website or in your most recent Alive newsletter. We're also starting the Emerging Leaders Mentor Program. So if you are interested in this development opportunity, we would encourage you again to go to the website and check out more information about how you can be a mentee or a mentor. And from here, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides for just a few seconds and we'll get started. But welcome. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm just going to start sharing my slides, so if you just give me a moment. Okay, so I hope that everyone can see that slide there and not any other windows that I've put over the top of it. If there is any issue, please just pop that in the Q&A because I think that's the only chat that is working at the moment. But otherwise, yeah, I guess that I will just go ahead and get started. Yeah, what I would like you all to do just before we move on is to open a copy of the session slides. So I will be sharing my screen as we move through, but if you have your own copy open as well, it means that you can look back at slides and click on links, and that's going to be especially helpful during the activities that we have. So I did ask that could be sent out to you beforehand, but I don't think that that was possible. So I've also asked if it could be popped in the chat for you to download. The chat is not working. So Amy, Nicole, I'm not sure, could that be posted in the Q&A? Is it possible to upload a file into the Q&A?
I am going to try right now.
Okay, so I'll just kind of do a self-introduction while we're waiting for that. So I have about 10 years experience working and of course volunteering with a variety of different organisations in the UK non-profit sector. That's my accent, British accent. And the expertise kind of area was volunteer management and engagement. And I now help non-profits all over the world via my own company, which is called Resource Vol. And I have a special focus on volunteer recruitment, induction and training. And I'm here today to talk about recruitment in terms of how existing volunteer leaders can grow their leader team. And before we jump in, I just wanted to make a kind of important distinction for the purposes of this session between volunteer leaders who are volunteers and volunteer managers who are paid staff, and probably most of the people who are kind of signed up and listening to this webinar right now. There isn't that kind of distinction in the normal world, I would say. You know, a volunteer manager is also a volunteer leader. But for the purposes of this presentation, I just wanted to make that distinction because this session was deliberately designed as a guide for existing volunteer leaders, because they are actually best placed to recruit more volunteer leaders because they have that first-hand experience as volunteers. They're likely to be genuinely passionate and enthusiastic about the role and know all of the ins and outs and so on. However, If you aren't a volunteer leader on top of being a volunteer manager, don't worry. Everything that we're going to cover today is, of course, also really useful for volunteer managers looking to recruit volunteer leaders, and it's also knowledge that you can pass on to your volunteer leader teams as and when you need to do that. So yeah, that's kind of just a quick covering of the basics, and I hope that we can get the file shared somehow. But in the meantime, let's move on. So we're going to kick off with the aim and objective so that we know what it is that we're trying to achieve and what we're going to look at. And the aim of this presentation is to give existing volunteer leaders the knowledge and confidence needed to successfully grow their volunteer leader team. And to achieve this aim, we have 6 objectives: to understand what we mean when we talk about a volunteer leader, to know what skills and personal qualities make good volunteer leaders and how to approach volunteers about becoming a leader, to know what special events and shadowing opportunities we can organise to allow for a kind of gradual introduction to leader roles, to understand the influence that existing leaders can have on whether a volunteer becomes a leader or not, and then finally to learn how to identify and remove different barriers to becoming a leader. So we'll be covering quite a lot during this session, and we also have a few activities to hopefully keep everyone engaged. They might not kind of happen in the way that they were originally intended because of the few tech issues that we're having today. And also this session was designed to be delivered via a kind of meeting, and we're in a webinar, so there is a kind of less interactivity, but we will manage. If you have any burning questions as we're going along, please pop those in the Q&A box. But just so you know, there's going to be some dedicated time for questions at the end as well. And it's also worth noting that the focus throughout this session is going to be on growing your volunteer leader team from within your organization's existing volunteer pool. And this is usually more effective rather than approaching people outside your organization, because those existing volunteers are actually already committed to your organization. They understand how things work, and they have that experience that's usually necessary to step up into a leader role. So the first thing that we need to look at then is what we actually mean by a volunteer leader. So the definition that I've popped up here on the slide is actually borrowed from the Vision for Volunteering. And if you haven't heard of the Vision for Volunteering, do check it out. I think Amy can give me a hand here by posting a URL in the Q&A maybe, or in the chat. But anyway, it's a 10-year collaborative project based in the UK, and it was designed to create a better future for volunteering. And they spoke with volunteers and staff from over 300 organisations, and they found that volunteer leaders are people who want the opportunity to shape their volunteering, share power, and lead change. Also, I'm just checking in the chat as well, and we can send links and all things like that out afterwards as well, of course. So don't worry if you don't get access to those during this session. So anyway, popping back to this definition on the slide, if any of your volunteer roles provide the opportunity to do these things, so to shape volunteering, share power, lead change, then it's likely that they're leader roles, even if you haven't thought about them in that way before. And I would say that most nonprofits will have leader roles of some sort, and that could be in a formal capacity. So it could be that you have actual role descriptions with clear leader role titles, for instance, or it could be in a more informal capacity. So sometimes it is the case that volunteers have naturally become kind of leaders because of the length of time that they've been volunteering with your organisation, or the level of experience that they've accrued, and so on. And of course, leader roles will differ between organisations, but in my experience, they do tend to have some key elements in common which tend to set them apart from a standard volunteer role. For example, a time commitment. So this could be a request from your organisation that volunteers attend sessions every week or every month instead of coming along on an ad hoc basis, or maybe it's a role that you ask for a kind of minimum time period commitment, so maybe like 6 months or a year, and obviously all of these are just hopes, requests. We never put anything down as saying this is a requirement when we're talking about volunteering. Extra responsibilities is another one. So if volunteers are prepping or planning sessions, if they're ordering equipment, if they're submitting reports or anything like that, those would be examples of extra responsibilities. Leading other volunteers. So this one may be a slightly more obvious one because it has the word leading in the title, but it could include things like delegating tasks, listening to feedback from other volunteers, or providing kind of support in their roles, helping to induct them or train them, and so on. representing the organization. This could be at internal or external events, or it could be in the media. So if you're asking a volunteer to kind of do a radio interview or something for a newspaper article, that would be representing the organization as well. And then finally, attending meetings. So if your volunteers are coming along to meetings outside of normal volunteer sessions, maybe they're helping to discuss and resolve issues, maybe you're asking them kind of to have a say in how the organization is run, those sorts of things. And leader roles don't have to include all of these things. And especially actually because volunteers are increasingly shying away from what we would see as the more traditional volunteering. So the stuff that's kind of regular, ongoing, has a heavy time commitment, maybe it's in person, it's the same time, and so on. People are kind of moving away from that and seeking more flexibility. So they want more kind of ad hoc, flexible, temporary, remote roles and things like that. So there is no need for volunteer leader roles to be big and overwhelming. One or two of these elements is enough for it to be a leader role. And there might actually be other elements, and especially ones that are relevant to the unique circumstances of your nonprofit organization. And that's why we're going to do a quick activity now to get your input. So your understanding of what a volunteer leader is could be quite different depending on how things are done in your organization or based on your personal experience of volunteering. So it would be really great to add some of your ideas into the mix. So for this activity, I was hoping that we could use the chat so you can share your thoughts on what a volunteer leader is to you. So maybe if you just pop that in as a kind of question, and I can see all of those that come up, and then we can hopefully find some way of kind of collating them afterwards, because it will be useful to be able to refer back to them. You can expand on the general elements that we've just looked at, and I've listed those on the slide here in the bullet points, or you can suggest something completely new. It might help to think about existing leader roles within your organisation or your personal experience of leader roles. I hope that makes sense for everyone, so please kind of go ahead and pop those in the Q&A. And we'll just have a few minutes on that, and I'll kind of read them out as they come in. Oh, we already have some coming in, which is great. So Julie has said mentor, Susan, someone who assists other volunteers and assigns tasks. Pascal, leading or co-leading a volunteer training class. Rebecca, a volunteer leader helps develop growth resources. That's an interesting one. Jessie, someone who has experience and can guide others within their roles. Sure. That sounds very much like kind of someone who might shadow as well, which is something that we're going to look at later on in the session. Erin has put dedicated and engaged volunteer whose feedback guides our decision making.
There are some folks on the Canva link as well. I was able to share that in the answered Q&A.
Sorry, Amy, could you repeat that?
There have been some folks active in the Canva link that was able to be posted out.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I wasn't sure if we were going to share that, but I see that now. So I'm looking at both. Okay, so someone who supports the program and the volunteers, schedulers / day captains. That's interesting. I've never heard that term before, day captain. That sounds great. Someone willing to lead with mission in mind and set the tone of the organization, making it possible to do our work at a scale that we wouldn't otherwise. I think, sorry, I'm reading that as someone is typing. That's probably not helpful. That poor person is probably like, wait. Someone committed to the organization's mission. A consistent / regular volunteer who's been fully delegated a task / project. Someone who brings other volunteers into the organization and advocates the mission with others to help us grow. This is amazing. These are all like really interesting answers, and there's so much contribution here that I don't think I'm going to be able to read everything out. But especially if you are able to pop that into the interactive whiteboard, then for sure we will be able to share it afterwards. I'm not 100% sure if we can use the, save the Q&A. But yeah, I don't know if Amy or Nicole, maybe if you have time to transfer the ones that were posted in the Q&A into the interactive whiteboard. That was my bad, sorry.
Yes,
Instead of switching to the interactive whiteboard. Brilliant. But yeah, thank you to everyone for those contributions, because there's so much variety in there. There's some stuff that I think is kind of fairly general, and it can easily be applied across roles and organizations. And there's some other stuff that's very specific. So the day captain one, for instance, I think that's something that's quite specific to an organization. And all of them are valid, and I hope give us a much more kind of comprehensive idea and understanding of what a volunteer leader is. So like I said, yeah, we'll try and kind of collate these notes and share them with everyone after the session. But right now we're going to move on from looking at what a volunteer leader is to what it takes to be effective as a leader, which usually means having certain skills and personal qualities. Sorry, my slides are just being a little bit slow. I'm waiting for them to catch up. Okay, so hopefully you can see this skills slide here. It says there are 5 skills on here. We've got communication, teamwork, problem solving, leadership, and organization. And these are all very useful general skills for volunteer leaders. It doesn't mean that they will always necessarily be good for a leader role, but they're kind of some good general ones. And when trying to grow your volunteer leader team, it's worth keeping an eye out for volunteers who display some or all of them, all of these skills during regular volunteer sessions. And then we have personal qualities. So being dependable, positive, resourceful, approachable, and calm under pressure all tend to be very useful personal qualities for volunteer leaders. And just as with the skills, it's worth keeping an eye out for volunteers who show some or all of these personal qualities during volunteer sessions. And like I said, volunteers don't have to have all of these skills or personal qualities to become leaders, or necessarily any of them. They can develop them by taking on the role. You can even encourage people to take on the leader role by kind of highlighting how it can help them to develop desirable skills and personal qualities. But that is a more challenging approach. So probably they're going to need extra support in the beginning. So you'll kind of need to weigh up the benefits with the potential negative impact on other volunteers and the service you're delivering. So that's kind of a decision that is specific to your organization. And then also, of course, we have some skills and personal qualities that are kind of specific to leader roles. And your organization might already have identified some examples like these ones on the slide for your specific leader roles. And if not, you might find it useful to go away and think about what skills and personal qualities, if you are a volunteer leader, that you personally tend to rely on, or ask other existing leaders in your organization what they think is important. And then you can use those alongside the more general ones that we've just looked at to help you identify volunteers who would do particularly well as leaders within your organization. And once you've identified a volunteer, the next step is to approach them about becoming a leader. So on this slide, we have these bullet points, and it says 5 top tips for selling a leader role. And I think that usually people kind of think the word selling is out of place, especially in the context of nonprofits and volunteering. But it is actually something that we do every day in all kinds of situations, and often we don't even realize what we're doing. So a good example is if you tell a friend or family member about a book or a film that you enjoyed recently, or maybe you found a cafe that you think is great, or like you have a new gadget that you think is really useful. All of that stuff is selling, and we don't necessarily think of it that way. And the best salespeople genuinely believe in what they're selling. So it doesn't really feel like selling, because you just think, hey, this is a great thing and I want to share it with people because I think it will improve their lives or they'll enjoy it and so on. But if you don't like thinking about volunteer leader roles as kind of selling, then you can think about it as encouraging and empowering volunteers to become leaders. But it doesn't kind of matter how you think about it or describe it. There are some things that you can do to make it more likely that volunteers will want to take on leader roles. So the first one is to focus on the positives. There's always going to be positives and negatives to every situation. So when we're talking about being a volunteer leader, we need to remember to focus on the positives. You wouldn't be a leader if you didn't think the role was important and rewarding, so make sure that you let your passion and your enthusiasm shine through, because it's definitely catching. And if you aren't a leader, if you are a volunteer manager, you need to be passionate and enthusiastic about involving volunteers as leaders, because if you seem unsure or reluctant, then volunteers will not come on board as leaders. be genuine and honest, meaning that you shouldn't say that you love everything about the role or everything about the role is great, unless it really is, which is honestly quite unlikely. And don't pretend that it's easy if it isn't easy. It could be challenging, and that's okay. You just need to make sure that you're setting realistic expectations early on, and it is possible to be honest about the challenging parts of the role without being negative. So again, focusing on the positives, which is number one. And then number 4 is making sure everything is clear. So what the leader role involves, what the induction and training process is like, making sure that you have answers ready for common questions and know where to send volunteers if they need more information. All of this stuff is really important. And then number 5 is to adapt your approach. So this one is about the fact that we can communicate more effectively if we understand about different social styles and we learn how to change our behavior to match the person that we're communicating with, which is what we're going to look at now. But I just want to pause before we move on to that and check if there are any questions that I have missed, because we're using kind of different platforms and I've got lots of windows open. So I don't know, Amy, is there something that I should be doing?
There was a question about going back and showing the slide that had the skills on it.
Okay, well, let me just navigate back there.
And we are not seeing slides right now.
Oh, that's strange. Let me go back in and see. It says that I am screen sharing.
I can see them.
Oh, you can, okay.
Okay, Amy, has anything changed for you? Can you see them?
No, but I'm hoping that I am unique, so.
Okay, Nicole, can you still see them?
Yes, and there's a couple of people in the chat who are saying that they can still see them, that they can see them.
And it's on the skills slide at the moment, so I hope that
Yes,
is...
that's what we see.
Okay, and I'll just move it over to the personal qualities slide as well, just in case anyone wanted another look at that. But do remember as well that you'll get a copy of these slides. If you haven't been able to get access to that yet, you will get a copy after the session. So you don't have to worry necessarily about taking lots of notes. Okay, so I'll just navigate back to where we were. Okay, so we're going to look at social styles now, which is something that you might have heard about before or something similar. There are lots of quite a lot of slightly different theories about communication styles and personality types and so on. And what we're looking at today is social style theory. And this is based on the work of 2 psychologists, Roger Reed and David Merrill. I hope I'm pronouncing their names correctly. And they suggested that we all have a set of natural behaviors and a preferred style of communication. And this essentially means that we're all more comfortable interacting with people who have a social style that's similar to our own, which in turn means that we can communicate more effectively with volunteers about becoming a leader if we understand about different social styles and learn how to adapt our style to suit the volunteers. So we're going to find out what the different social styles are by looking at the social style model, which uses 2 dimensions to identify 4 different social styles. And I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. So the first dimension of the model is assertiveness, whether we tend to ask or we tend to tell, and that's represented on the slide by the horizontal line. And then the second dimension is responsiveness, whether we control our emotions or outwardly display them, and that's represented on the slide by the vertical line. And then in the spaces created where these 2 dimensions cross over, we can see each of the 4 different social styles represented here by different shapes. So on the left, we can see that stars and circles both tend to ask, but stars control their emotions and circles display their emotions. And then on the right, we can see that diamonds and triangles both tend to tell, but diamonds control their emotions and triangles display their emotions. So I hope everyone is still with me here. For me, this is like a lot of jargon. The important thing to note is that social styles, are based on the perception of a person's behavior by others, and that they don't necessarily relate to personality. And it's also really unlikely that anyone's going to fit perfectly into one social style or another, but people do tend to operate within one kind of overriding social style. So it can be useful in that respect. So we're going to take a quick look at the different characteristics of each social style and how we can adapt our approach for the best result. And when I say quick, it really is going to be quick. We're not going to spend very long on each of the social styles because there's an activity coming up where you'll have time to look at them in detail on your own, I hope. This was kind of based on you having access to the slides already, so you could look back at them. But we will figure out a way to allow you to kind of look at the slides in detail otherwise. So yeah, this is just going to be a quick overview. So we start off with stars, who tend towards asking and control their emotions. So you can see on the slide, we have these 10 characteristics on the left, and then we have 3 tips for effective communication on the right. And if you identify from this list of characteristics that you're communicating with a star, the best approach is to present hard facts and figures, expect questions, and be patient. Now we move on to circles, who also tend towards asking but display their emotions. And again, you've got these 10 characteristics on the left, and then the 3 tips for effective communication on the right. So if you identify from this list of characteristics that you're communicating with a circle, the best approach is to focus on building a relationship, capture their imagination, and be decisive. Now, diamonds, who tend towards telling and control their emotions. If you're communicating with a diamond, the best approach is to provide evidence and have answers ready, highlight the benefits, and be concise. And finally, we have triangles, who also tend towards telling but display their emotions. And if you're communicating with a triangle, the best approach is to connect with emotion, emphasize personal experience, and give them space. So the activity we're going to do now is so that you can put this new knowledge, or maybe it's existing knowledge, maybe you already know about social styles, which is great. But either way, we're going to put this knowledge into practice. And it's an independent activity, so you can make your own notes in whatever way is most comfortable for you. Like I said before, I was hoping you could use your PDF copy of the slides to kind of refer back to the relevant pages as needed. I don't know, Nicole or Amy, if it's possible to send an email out to all of the participants now with a copy of those slides so that everyone has them, if it's not possible for us to share that in this webinar. And I also do have an audio recording which covers the main bulk of the text about the different social styles, just in case anyone had trouble reading the PDF file for any reason. So it might be worth sending that out at the same time. But it is just the audio format of the stuff that's in the PDF. So if it's not required, then you can just ignore it because it's like duplicated information. Okay, so while Amy and Nicole are figuring that out, I hope I will run through the instructions for the activity. So the first thing to do is identify your own social style. Then choose a social style that's different from your own, and write 3 to 5 bullet points selling a volunteer leader role to the social style that you've chosen. This works best if you're thinking about a specific role that you know well. And finally, make sure to use the tips provided for effective communication with the different styles. So those tips that are on the right-hand side of each of the slides for the different social styles. And also remember the 5 top tips for selling a leader role, which you should be able to look back at as well. So I hope that everyone understands that as an activity. I think that Amy can post the activity instructions in the chat if needed. Let's see. Okay, so what I'm going to do as a kind of workaround right now, if you aren't able to see the information for the social styles, is I'm going to go back so that you can have more of a read of them in turn. And I'll try and leave each one up for a little while and then move on. So the activity time for this is 10 minutes. So it's 22, and then we will kind of come back and I will carry on with the presentation. And if you look in the answered section of the Q&A box, then there is a link to the slides that you should be able to download from volunteeralive.org. So I've been cycling through the relevant slides just in case anyone wasn't able to access those. So I hope that you've all been able to have the relevant information to complete this activity, and you still have 4 minutes. And if there is a slide you need to look at again, you want me to put up, then please just let me know and I'll do that. You can pop it in the Q&A and I will keep an eye on it. Okay, so that has been 10 minutes. I hope that that was enough time for everyone, especially if you had to kind of wait for me to cycle through those slides again. This is thankfully an activity that you can do on your own after this session as well. And actually, I would advise doing that if possible, because then you can kind of do it for each of your leader roles, pitching to each of the social styles, and you will have a kind of quick reference folder of examples that you can use, and then also different people in your organization can use as well. So it would be good if you kind of return to this activity, and also probably useful if you practice your pitch on someone who identifies with the social style that you chose, so they can give you feedback, you know, was it convincing, could anything be improved, and so on. But yeah, otherwise, thank you for taking the time to do that activity. And now we're going to move on to look at events, which are another important part of encouraging volunteers to become leaders. And in this session, we're going to look at 3 examples of events that you could organise for volunteers outside of your normal volunteer sessions. So the first example is a volunteer social. Holding regular social events for volunteers is something that can help them to feel more like part of a team, as I'm sure you all know. But as a leader, you can also use social events as an opportunity to spot the skills and personal qualities that we looked at earlier and to identify those different social styles. Of course, the kind of activity that you organise will depend on your organisation's policy and budget for stuff like this, but it's worth remembering that you can organise social events online and at very little cost if needed, so it is worthwhile trying to do that. The second event example is a volunteer leader meetup. This is a more formal opportunity for volunteers to meet up with leaders outside a normal volunteer session and learn about the leader roles within your organisation. So ideally, it should be something which makes conversation easy, so avoiding anything that's too loud or overstimulating. And all volunteers should be invited to these events. But if you want to encourage certain volunteers to attend because you've identified, hey, that person's going to make a really good leader, then extending personal invitations are a good idea because it shows that you've noticed someone and that you value their contribution. And for sure, it is more difficult to say no to a personal invitation than it is to kind of just ignore an all email invitation sent out to everyone. And then the third and final example is an out-of-hours taster or training session. And this type of event is aimed at volunteers who are already interested in becoming volunteer leaders. And it should allow them to learn exactly what leaders do, but without the pressure or the distraction of a normal volunteer session. That's why I've put kind of out of hours, because it's held out of a normal session time. And the idea is for the volunteer leader or leaders running this kind of event to demonstrate in a really practical manner everything that's required to carry out the leader role. Basically, it's a kind of practice session. So like, you know, a dry run, practice session, rehearsal. That's the idea behind it anyway. And ideally, you would have more than one volunteer attend this type of event because it can be quite time consuming to organize and run. And also a group context means that there's kind of less focus and less pressure on the individual. And so the experience will be less intimidating. So those 3, just a few examples of events that can help persuade volunteers to become leaders. And you might have some other ideas, some other things that you already do within your organisation. And if so, please do share them in the chat. And in the meantime, we're going to move on to look at shadowing, because this is another great way to encourage volunteers to become leaders. And by shadowing, I mean arranging for volunteers to follow and kind of watch an experienced leader so that they can learn about being a leader. If you already have volunteer leaders, this should be fairly straightforward, but if you don't, then probably staff will need to act as leaders in the beginning until you have enough active volunteer leaders to take over. For some volunteers, becoming leader can seem like a really big step, so shadowing is an important part of offering a gradual progression into a leader role. And volunteers who shadow are more likely to become leaders. They're also more likely to enjoy being a leader, and they're more likely to stay in the role for a longer period. So shadowing is actually really useful for lots of reasons. There are a few different kinds of shadowing that you can offer to your volunteers. Full shadowing is probably the most common, the most well-known kind of shadowing. It's where a volunteer accompanies a leader throughout a session. They observe everything and kind of develop an understanding of the responsibilities and the requirements of the leader role through that observation. And then the leader might also explain why certain tasks are required and how best to approach them, depending on what kind of the nature of the shadowing is and the session is and the volunteering and so on. Then another option for shadowing is bite-sized shadowing, and this is much more informal, much more flexible. The idea with this one is that leaders can show volunteers how to carry out just 1 or 2 specific leader tasks during a volunteer session, and there are no expectations, there's no pressure. Volunteers can just learn about the leader role in really manageable bite-sized parts, and there's no planning needed. It can just be done really spontaneously. So if the leader happens to have capacity during that session and a volunteer is interested, then it can just be done. And it's great usually to kind of make a note of what's been done, because it might be that a leader shows the same volunteer 1 or 2 things each week or at each session, and you want to kind of keep a record of what have they learnt. But that's really easy for the volunteer leader to kind of keep in mind with a little checklist, and I have a template for that if anyone's interested. And then the final example of shadowing is reverse shadowing. And this is for volunteers, ideally, who've already done another form of shadowing and they feel ready to take that next step towards becoming a leader. And the idea with reverse shadowing is that they can try leading their first session with an experienced leader watching them and ready to kind of answer questions or provide support if needed. And the experienced leader should also ideally give the volunteer feedback afterwards, so they can highlight what went well and any areas that could be improved and so on. So those are just a few quick examples of types of shadowing you could offer to volunteers. But it doesn't really matter how much shadowing you offer to volunteers if you aren't conscious of the influence of existing volunteer leaders on potential new leaders. So the way that you behave as a volunteer leader, or that your volunteer leaders behave, if you are the manager of volunteers, and especially the way that volunteer leaders interact with volunteers, can have a big impact on whether they decide to become leaders or not. And it's really important to be mindful of this, and remembering a few simple do's and don'ts can help make sure that the influence of volunteer leaders is positive rather than negative. And on this slide, it's quite text heavy, but don't worry, we're not going to go through it all kind of line by line. We have the do's on the left and the don'ts on the right. They're all fairly straightforward. They each have their own notes, so I'm not going to spend time going through each one of them individually, especially because you have your own copy. But we're just going to take a look at a couple of them together just to make sure that you get the idea. So if we take a look at one of the don'ts, the one at the top is don't be cliquey. So with this one, it's a really great thing to have a team where everyone knows each other and everyone gets on really well. And this does often happen in organizations where the same volunteers go along to every session, but it can also be really excluding. I know on a personal level that I've been in situations before where people are talking about something or laughing at something that I don't get, and it doesn't feel nice. Even if they're not doing it deliberately, it's just a really quick way to make someone feel excluded and intimidated. And obviously that's a really big disadvantage when you're trying to recruit more leaders. And it actually relates to being welcoming, which is at the top of the list of do's. Being welcoming might seem like something that's really obvious, but when we're busy or stressed, which does often happen when we're working with nonprofits and we're wearing like a million hats as a volunteer manager, we're maybe not as welcoming or friendly as we think we are or as we should be. So it's a good thing to kind of consciously check and prioritize, because if volunteers don't feel welcome in a standard role, then they certainly won't feel welcome taking on a leadership position. A really good way that I found in my roles as volunteer coordinator and volunteer manager to prioritize being welcoming is to have a volunteer briefing at the beginning of each session, and not just time to explain how things work and delegate tasks quickly, but to say a proper hello and kind of do introductions and thank everyone for being there, because it doesn't actually take much time. It's just a couple of extra minutes, but it can make a huge difference to the experience of the volunteer and making them feel welcome. So yeah, just a couple there that we looked at in detail together, and you can look at the rest at your own pace after the session. And for now, we're going to move on to our final topic, which is barriers. There can be all sorts of barriers to becoming a leader, especially across different organizations, and it can be a little bit overwhelming, but to make things more manageable, I found it is useful to divide barriers into 2 types. So on this side, hopefully you can see that we have perceived barriers on the left, and these are the kind that usually we can remove really quickly and easily just by making sure that volunteers have the right information about policies and processes that we have within our organizations. An example of this is taking the kind of top bullet point of time. Volunteers might think that they need to devote more time to being a leader than is actually necessary. So making sure that they have a clear understanding of your organization's recommended time commitment for a leader role can help to overcome that barrier really quickly and easily. And then we have actual barriers on the right, and these can be more challenging to address than the perceived barriers. And probably with these, you'll have to consider individual needs and circumstances and try to kind of be flexible and find a solution that works for everyone. And it could involve some research, some creative thinking, some compromise. And another example, again, related to the top bullet point, which is time. It's possible that some volunteers really don't have enough time to be a leader, according to organization's recommended time commitment for the role, but it is likely the organization can be flexible, especially if you really do need more leaders. Because if you have someone, for example, who's able to lead a session once a month, but normally you want someone who's available once a week, well, having someone who can lead once a month surely is still better than having no one, especially if, you know, your sessions might need to be cancelled otherwise. So that's the kind of, you know, maybe you don't really want to do that because this is kind of the rule and this is what you've said in the past, but in this way, you can get rid of a barrier and you can have a leader on board. And excuse me, I worked with an organization once where we had this exact issue where we would say, as a leader, this is the expectation. And there would be someone who came along and said, well, okay, I can't do this once a month, but I can do it once every 3 months. Is that okay? And we were worrying that the volunteer leader team, the existing volunteer leader team would kind of resent that person because they would say, oh, well, we came on board and we do this, you know, every month, but they get to come on and just do it once every 3 months. But actually the leader team were so happy to have an extra person that could even do it once every 3 months. You know, there was no resentment there. There was no anger or aggravation towards that person. They were just very much welcomed on board. So if that is something that you're worried about, that might just be a barrier that you've put up in your own mind that doesn't exist. Just a little example there from my previous experience. And I feel like I've spoken quite a lot now, and definitely my throat is itchy. With this final topic, we also have one final activity, so I can stop talking for a little while. And this one is to get you more familiar with this way of thinking about and identifying barriers so that hopefully you feel more confident about applying it within your organization in the future. And this was meant to be a group activity, but because of this webinar format, I don't think it's possible to do the breakout rooms, but it is possible for us to change it into an independent activity instead. So we will use an interactive whiteboard to take notes because I would really like to be able to share these with everyone after the session. So I think that Amy is going to pop the link to the second interactive whiteboard in the chat. I'm not sure if it will be in the open section or the answered section, but just have a little look there in the chat for that second Canva interactive whiteboard. And then while that's happening, I'll go through the instructions and hopefully we can also paste them in the chat so you can refer back to them if needed. So this first one doesn't apply anymore. It was going to be to choose a scribe or note taker for your breakout room, but that will be yourself now. This is an independent activity. So what you'll do is come up with at least one example of each barrier type. So a perceived barrier and an actual barrier, thinking about things that could prevent someone from becoming a volunteer leader. If you have time, please go ahead and think of more than one example for each barrier type. That would be great. But for the time that I've kind of allowed for this, I think that one of each is kind of reasonable. You can use the bullet points that I've provided as a starting point, or you can go with something completely different, and your examples can be generic or they can be specific to a particular organization or volunteer leader role. How you approach this is completely up to you, whatever you are going to find most useful going forward. And then finally, agree with yourself what action could be taken to remove or reduce the barriers that you've identified. So hopefully everyone understands the instructions for that activity, and we have 10 minutes again, so that will take us up to 5 past the hour. And yeah, we also have a tip for adding notes to the interactive whiteboard, but I think everyone was managing really well in the previous one, and I think Amy might have posted that tip in the chat as well. So yeah, as usual, post in the chat and I'll try and keep an answer on it. If you have a question, if you need me to go back to anything, and otherwise you have 10 minutes, so until 5 past. If you are struggling to access or use Canva for any reason, please do post in the Q&A and hopefully Amy can grab that and pop it into the Canva whiteboard for you, because I don't want to kind of miss out on anyone's contributions just because of tech. That would be awful. I think that I will give everyone a couple more minutes on this because I can still see a lot of typing and moving post-it notes around going on the whiteboard, which is great. And I want to give everyone time to get your ideas down. So yeah, an extra, I think 3 minutes or so should be fine. So 8 past. Okay, so I think that I will carry on now, but actually all we'll be doing is kind of wrapping up. So if you want to carry on popping things in the interactive whiteboard in the meantime, that is perfectly fine. Please go ahead and do that. So, and by the way, I was looking at the interactive whiteboard and there is so much amazing stuff on there. So thank you to all of you for contributing to the whiteboard, and I will make sure to get a copy of that sent out to all of you afterwards, because that is essentially a reference book of barriers that I hope will be useful for everyone going forward. So yeah, thank you very much. So to finish up, let's quickly review our aim and objectives just to make sure that everyone's happy that we've done what we set out to do. My slides are being very slow again. Let me just double check that I'm still sharing. Yeah, that looks fine. Okay, so the aim of this session was to give existing volunteer leaders the knowledge and confidence needed to successfully grow their volunteer leader team. And to achieve this aim, we had 6 objectives. Let me check. hopefully those are up on the screen for you now, and I hope that you agree that we've met these objectives. I'll just give you a moment to read through them, and please let me know if you think we missed anything or if you're not sure what any of those objectives refer to. Sometimes it isn't super obvious. So we have this one, learn how to approach volunteers. That was the one where we looked at the top tips for selling and then the different social styles. And now is also a good time if there are any just general outstanding questions, or if you wanted to pop a question in the chat, that will be fine as well.
We see the slide, well, I see the slide aim and objectives, but they're in a clipboard, but I don't see anything else.
Okay, let me see if I can go backwards and forwards. Is that working now? I think there's a bit of a glitch going on.
Do you think maybe if you stop share and reshare, is it worth it at this point? I don't know.
I'll give it a go. Did that help?
Yes, we can see it now.
Yes.
Brilliant. So if you would like, I think one thing I would say about what we covered is we just like kind of scratched the surface of identifying and removing barriers to becoming a leader, because of kind of the fact that we focused on barriers to becoming a leader. There are also loads of barriers to just volunteering in general. And I think some of the barriers that everyone was writing on the whiteboard could be applied to either, which is great as well. But if you did want to learn more about barriers to volunteering in general, I have a video guide to enabling volunteering, which is available for free on YouTube. So hopefully we can share the link to that. And there might be some other free resources on the YouTube channel that you're interested in too. So maybe we can share the link just to the general YouTube channel. And I do post content really regularly, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything, and also please let me know if there's anything specific that you'd want me to cover, so any specific kind of resources or topics that you want to see in the future, because I really want to make sure that I'm spending time creating stuff that is useful for people and not just what I think is useful for people. I'm not seeing any outstanding questions in the Q&A. I don't know if that's because people are still adding stuff to the whiteboard, or there just aren't any questions, which is also perfectly fine. Okay, so otherwise, I just want to make sure that I say thank you to everyone for attending this session today and for all of your amazing contributions for the activities. I hope that you found it useful. If you do want to get in touch with me in the future, please feel free to email me at hello@resourceworld.com, or there's also a contact form on my website if you prefer to go that route. And otherwise, I hope that I will see you again in the future. We'll hear from you in the future, and kind of that's everything from me, unless there are any questions that I have missed. Amy, I don't know if you have something for me.
We are just so incredibly thankful for you being here and riding through all of the technology challenges that we've had. This has been a wonderful presentation. There's been so much activity on those Canva boards, and so we will make sure we get those and the slides and the recording recording, all of those things shared out. I do have in the Q&A put both of the links that we were talking about, the Enabling Volunteer Guide, as well as the YouTube links. We'll add those to the email that goes out afterwards as well. So just thank you for being here. We are so appreciative. We love having presenters join us. We especially love when they are coming from outside of the States. And so this is pretty special. I think you're our second international speaker. So thank you so much. I think the group would also agree it's been a wonderful session despite some of the technology challenges that we've had. We have added the Google's form link if you'd fill out the session evaluation for us. We would greatly appreciate that, and we hope to see everyone in February.